All right, coming in hot today. Welcome. I actually made it right on time. But what is time? Am I right? So, just we just finished up putting up the Christmas tree. So I was putting all the extra containers and stuff that we don't need in here into storage. So that's where I basically ran in and got this all set up. So in this live talk, we're going to discuss non-dual dissociation, what that means to you, and what that means about everything and nothing. So welcome. And if you're catching this after the fact, I've got a bunch of other videos you can check out, especially some of my earlier ones. The favorite that people like is the best method to achieve non-duality. But if you have not yet subscribed to my YouTube channel, just click, obviously you know what to do, click subscribe. So then when I go live, usually on the weekends, depending on what's going on, you can join me for a discussion on non-duality and the specific idea that we're covering for this video. So if you have any questions as you're popping on here today, throw them in the chat box and I will get to them as I get to them. But in this first part of the video, I'm not going to sit and meditate and get centered, because with non-duality, life happens as it does. What is always the truth of the matter at hand. So I'm going to go get some tea, settle in. Welcome if you're joining us now. And I will be back here in just a jiffy. So, and I'm going to plug this in just in case. All right. Okay. All right. I'll be back. Okay, I've got my peppermint tea. I'm now fully centered in my chi or ki, chai, tea. And there literally was no person for an undisclosed period of time. But what is time if you don't take time? Or how can you have time if you don't take time? And if you don't plug in the plug to charge your laptop, plugging it into the laptop doesn't really make much of a difference. So, I need one more second. It's one of those days today. But welcome, Daryl, Alex. They're wondering if I'm still alive. Actually, I was watching, I caught the end of the Vikings and Lions game on the television, and it was a funny ending. So, but I will be back. I gotta get some pillows to sit behind. Okay. I mean, I needed to get pillows to sit in front of, not behind, but you get it. So hopefully that was a long enough delay to get people to join that maybe weren't able to get on right away. So if you've been sitting here patiently waiting for the discussion here, I apologize for the delay. But when it comes to non-duality, you're supposed to just be patient and not care about being impatient. Oh boy, I was gonna start this discussion with reading one of the comments on one of my videos, and I have forgotten my cell phone. So now I have to go get that.
Nice job.
I think I don't know where I put it. Oh, it's on the bed. I got it. Okay. I'm back. It's official now. I am in my spot for the duration of the flight. So please buckle up. And as we take off here, please put your tray in the upright position and get ready to discuss non-duality. I hear an echo, honey. That's a little distracting. So, well, Alex says it's okay, haha. So I'm glad you have dealt with my sporadic entrance here. And that's kind of the way of life. We expect it to be one way, and it goes whatever way that it does. And when it doesn't go the way we want or expect, then we get frustrated. And oftentimes we want to find ways to control the reality that we see in front of us. And so it's, the beauty of non-duality is the message is kind of pointing to the fact that ultimately we have no control. We have no control over the time that it will be when we exit the animated plane into whatever comes after, when we die, if you will. But we were always part of the aliveness, so in a sense we never die in that way. But this isn't a discussion of life after death, because ultimately I have no idea what happens when your blood turns cold and your heart stops beating. So we're here right now because that's what's happening. Daryl says, well, this is about as exciting as watching a wall. Watching a wall can be exciting, though. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing about non-duality is, when you expect a speaker to do a certain thing, or to speak in a certain way, or to be super eloquent, or have a lot of clarity with the message, in a sense that it's helpful, and in another sense it's not, because it's kind of geared towards the egoic mind, the separate self, however you want to define it. And it gives it something to, I guess, mentally play around with and think about and consider and try to understand. But this message is not something that you can intellectually understand. And so by trying to do so in that sense, it's kind of going in the opposite direction, the direction that doesn't really exist. Daryl says, okay, tell me when that happens, I don't want to miss it. It's happening right now. You're missing it. So I'm going to read the comment that kind of spurred the idea for the discussion for this video. Oh, here it is. Okay. This is a comment to my self-improvement and non-duality live talk that I did a few different weeks ago. It's from Skydog 404. Skydog says, hi, Russ. Enjoy, since you're not there anyway. This body-mind organism watched for a few minutes, then apparently if left your channel. I think Skydog meant it. So enjoy, since you're not there anyway. This body, mind, organism, watch for a few minutes, then apparently it left your channel. So I'm not exactly sure if there's some sarcasm built into that comment. But I think just the way it was written kind of reminds me of how a lot of times when people speak about non-duality, it's in the third person perspective, meaning we talk about that there is no person. What is here is just kind of a mental construct of how we describe what is, and there's really no clear differentiation or separation from the environment. So if you try to really define or point to what it is that is you, then you never really find it. And so in that context of how we're describing non-duality, then sometimes people refer to themselves as Russ Rapp saying this, or, I'm not really here, or things are just happening. There is no me. The me is an illusion. And I think what that can lead to is this idea that in order to obtain enlightenment, or to obtain that which non-duality is pointing to, there has to be this sense of disconnection from the personal, disconnection from the me or the self. And so I think what that can lead to is just another form of dissociation from ourselves. And in a sense, I think in the discussion of these topics, I think there needs to be kind of a description as to what the difference is between when you are perceivably dissociating from your separate self, or differentiating from your separate self. And I know Ken Wilber in some of his books talks about the difference between a dissociation and differentiation when things are growing, evolving. So he talks about transcending and including, and what can happen to some extent is there's a dissociation or a separation from the realities. And I'm not going to get into all that detail because it kind of loses the forest for the trees, but I think there's a difference in approach to non-duality when someone's dissociating the concept of what we're speaking of, or differentiating, or sometimes I've called it objectification, or creating a difference between who you perceive yourself to be and who you thought you were before, essentially. And so there's this sense where if you're trying to find yourself, you're trying to determine who you are, what it means to be real, or what it means to be alive, when you witness either your physical self or your emotions or your thoughts, when you observe those things, then those things become an object in and of themselves. And so in a sense, some people would say consciousness or awareness separates from that which it's observing. And so then we identify personally with the witness of the objective world. And so whereas before, when we've seen ourselves as an individual person with a name, a story, a physical space, a concept, an intellect, an energetic field, however you want to describe it, when we see ourselves in that way and that becomes objectified, then we're able to see it in a separate, in a new way, essentially. And I think that can be helpful in certain ways when you're really grounded or identified or attached to the separate self. It can cause issues with how you relate to reality in general. And so one example I thought of here recently is, when it comes to negative self-talk, when it comes to these thought processes that are usually habitual, that repeat themselves over and over again, or are overly negative, or ultimately subjective in a sense that's not close to what's actually happening. That they themselves are merely describing a world that isn't really there, essentially. And so when we say things like, you can't do this, or you're not worth it, or, your life has no meaning, or, you never do anything right, whatever the negative self-talk that's there, in the sense where we can separate from that and see it objectively instead of identifying with those thoughts, we're able to evaluate what's happening in a different way. And I think a lot of times when we do identify with that aspect of ourselves, then we are able to continue that habit without awareness of it, or give it energy that it doesn't necessarily need to have. And that's where I think people run into problems or issues. And that in itself, the attachment to these concepts, these ideas or thoughts, can lead to other perceivable problems of, interrelations with other people, or addictions and that sort of thing. And so, one way to look at it is, when you're in those situations where there's a negative emotion or idea about who you are as a person that continues to run, oh, I wish life would be this different. I wish I wouldn't react in this way. Why do I always get anxious when this happens? Or I can't believe I just got angry and yelled at this person. Like, why am I so stupid? Why am I this way? Those are types of things where you're not necessarily name calling, but you have these negative thoughts that are kind of circling and compounding and building off of each other. And if you take a step back or a step aside and say, the way I communicate with myself, if I were to, would I ever do that to one of my loved ones, whether it's a spouse or a boyfriend or girlfriend, or your kids, or a relative or a friend? In a lot of cases, especially for, if you're thinking about it in the terms of a child who's, innocent, pure, and you're saying all these negative things about that person, it's like, well, I would never do that. Like, they don't know any better. This child is not mature, or hasn't developed the coping skills that they should have, or they had a rough upbringing or whatever. And you would feel horrible about saying mean things to that person. And so we're able to censor or stop those types of negative thoughts towards another person, but we're able to put up with it ourselves. And in the same way, it's like when, you say you go to work or school and you interact with people throughout the day, and it's, professional, or, it's somewhat superficial, but you're able to, put on a good face and present yourself a certain way. And then you get home after a day. And since you're comfortable with your significant other, you unload and act like a jerk to that person, because you let those barriers fall down and are able to kind of show that negative part that you have been kind of holding within, and allowing that to come out and be on display for others that are in your closer circle. And the reason why I'm kind of getting into that is because those aspects of yourself that maybe you don't like, or those negative thoughts that are continually coming up in your thought process, there's a sense, or there seems to be a need to run away or disassociate from those negative feelings or thoughts. And so when you get into non-duality, and you know, a lot of this talk is kind of geared more towards people that are aware of what non-duality is. So if you're new to it, you maybe don't even know exactly what I'm getting at here. But you know, I think what can happen is, instead of, you know, dealing with those issues, or facing them head on, or having the courage to see them for what they are, you know, it's easier to dissociate and say, well, that's not me. You know, that's just this person. It's a character. It's a story. It's something I tell myself. It's just a thought process. It's just this. And, you know, it's just, or I am not that. I am not this person. There is no me. It's just another kind of psychological defense mechanism that literally has nothing to do with non-duality. It's just another coping mechanism that the separate self, or the mind, uses to deal with the fact that you feel out of control of your life and what happens around you, and you seek to maintain or obtain the power and control that you are seeking. And so then there's, you know, if you look at it in that sense, that's kind of a way to disassociate from who you are. And I think differentiation would be including all that stuff that you're trying to mask or run away from. And so differentiation would be accepting all of those things that you want to pretend that aren't a part of who you are, because there is no person, right? And so I say "and so" a lot. I want to disassociate. I want to differentiate from saying that word or that phrase. But in the Bible, there's the verse where, and I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, I think, where it's God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And that first part is key. And what I'm getting at here is, God so loved the world. You know, so what is the world? That can be a question that you ask, but saying that God loves the world, it's looking at the world and accepting it. And so, you know, if you're approaching non-duality and you're looking at your life and you're saying, well, that's not me, I don't want that, you're not coming from a space of love. And so you're dissociating versus differentiating, or objectifying what isn't you, or what is a temporal, subjective, separate self. And so to differentiate is to include, and to dissociate is to separate and exclude, essentially. Because when you're differentiating, you're maintaining that connection. You're not trying to separate in a way that you can't really do in the first place, because that's kind of the illusion of it. So I'm going to get to your comments here. Oh, Daryl says, hope there's no fighting on this flight. Alex says, there are literally dozens of non-dual speakers. Where are they all coming from? Alex says, there are literally dozens of non-dual speakers. Where are they all coming from? I guess I'm not really sure. I can't really speak to others. You maybe have to ask them individually. But sometimes they may say, well, there is no me. There's no one that showed up. Like earlier in the video when I wasn't here and it was just a blank wall. You know, that's kind of what the message that they're trying to pass on to others that also didn't show up is that there is no one there. It's just a blank wall, which is, I think, purposely supposed to be frustrating to the audience, because the audience is there to try to get something or learn something or achieve something, whatever that may be. And so when you say, well, I'm not here and neither are you, then it's like, well, what's the point of this? And that's the point. But in another way, that's kind of can be taken, like I'm saying, in a dissociated stance, and use that as a way to cope with reality, to say, well, when you do things that you don't like, or behave in a certain way, or your attitude's a certain way, you can just say, well, I'm not here. I didn't show up because there is no me. And it's just a kind of an immature way of dealing with life. And I think the one phrase I thought of that it really maybe highlights or illuminates what I'm getting at is the old saying. It's maybe a little cliche, that in this world but not of it. So I think from a differentiating stance, in this world but not of it, there's kind of a way that says, hey, you're here. There is this reality. There's the real and the unreal, but you're not really of it. So you're not, there is no ultimate grounding. There's no absolute solidity, if you will, to it, because that's what ultimately what the mind and the separate self wants to do, is to claim some sort of solidity to something that is kind of passing shadows or clouds floating in the sky against the clear blue backdrop. And so there's no way to pin it down. That which we claim to be real, that which we say is the objective 3D world, only exists in the definitive way that we use our intellect or our mind in an abstract way to create that definition. Because the essence of something or everything isn't definable. But I think from a dissociative stance, instead of saying in this world but not of it, someone who's dissociating from reality, this is in this world but above this world. Meaning they're in it, but they're above it. So they're not going to be in the mucky muck of human reality, of messy relationships, of difficulties, of challenges, of struggle, of tyranny, of abuse, of neglect, of pain. They're in this world, but they're not of this world. But it's not even that. They're not even, they're above it all. They're kind of in their ivory tower. I think that's the mindset of kind of the unenlightened Buddha, the dissociative mindset when it comes to non-duality, which sometimes can come across with speakers in a certain way, but it's all about kind of like the interpretation that you glean from that person, whether they're coming from that space or not, or if there's meaning in that way and they're not aware of it. I guess to some extent is irrelevant, because everyone is like, oh, like that was the other comment I wanted to read as well. I thought was helpful and I appreciated it. When it comes from my best non-dual teacher on YouTube. And let's see, aware verse. I think it was when I was talking about, how do you determine the best teacher, best speaker of non-duality on YouTube? Like, what are the standards? What are the ways that we define or come up with who that person would be? And Aware Verse says, number 1, radicality. Not sure what that means. Number 2, integration, embodiment, authenticity, meaning you're living what you're saying. 3 is clarity, which I'm sure it's I'm not top of the list on that one. Number 4, position on choice, practice, just some ideas. So kind of coming up with some parameters of what, a good non-duality or the best non-duality teacher would be. I think it's interesting that radicality would be number 1. I think what that means is probably, I think what Aware Verse is getting at is a speaker who is completely out of step with convention or the normal way of things. Says things in a way that's completely foreign to people, that kind of thing, which non-duality itself is, because we're constantly told that our worth is dependent on certain things, or that we're always there to achieve and grow, and that is a part of life. But I think ultimately through non-duality, through an acceptance of non-duality, not necessarily how do I say this? I think through an acceptance of non-duality, there remains the struggle, but there's not the ultimate existential threat of absolution or falling into the void. There's the fear of nothingness, essentially, or if we fail, that we'll be doomed for eternity. And so when that is seen for what it is, then there will never be this freeing of struggle, if you will. And you can define pain or suffering. Sometimes suffering is the word that is discussed when it comes to this idea where there's no more suffering. But from an outside perspective, the suffering internally and externally, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, still happens. But I think the suffering is real. The lack of suffering is the realization that the ultimate reality of life is infinite love. I guess you could define it that way. Alex says, it's always a play, sir. Even if our discussion is about non-dual divine things or whatever, it can't be anything else than a play. Lewis says, your thoughts. Sickness mankind suffers from is the subtle kiss of duality. The moment you identify as a self, the ego, the mind believes that it to be the body as the source, not the awareness. I'm gonna kind of look into that here real quick. Lewis says, your thoughts, sickness mankind suffers from is the subtle kiss of duality. The moment you identify as the self, as a self, the ego, the mind believes that it is to be the body as the source, not the awareness. I think the dualistic nature of the mind, the ego, uses the concept, or can use the concept of awareness or consciousness as a way to continue suffering, if you will, because the mind does a great job as a kind of a magical entity of separating the mind from the body. And so, we think of our thoughts separate from the physical manifestation of who we believe to be ourselves. And the same thing with awareness or consciousness. And so, when you observe your internal processes, or you watch your thoughts or your emotions or your reactions to what is happening, then that observer self, if you will, becomes what we identify with. And if you notice in those moments where you're kind of above it, watching your life or your reactions or your thoughts, where is that awareness or observation coming from? And what is it focused on? And so it's, in a lot of times, that awareness is focused on you and either your current surroundings or the stories that you have in your head of what's happening elsewhere in space, or what has happened in the past or will happen potentially in the future. The focus is there, and so that awareness or consciousness is there. But the consciousness of non-duality has no localization, and so there's a when the outside or the separate observer is watching who you perceive yourself or the illusory self to be, the ego, that own awareness is just another aspect of the separation, because there's no way you as an ego, let's say, can go prior. And this is what I know Paul Hederman talks about this, but you can't go prior to the thought or the original sin, the original attachment to the separate self. Because if you're the thing, the object, if you will, that is going back to witness that original attachment is in itself the attachment that you're trying to be free from. And so that begs the question, well, if that's the case, how do I become free of the attachment? And that's where the idea of love, compassion, forgiveness comes into play, because that's how things work. Is you're always attached, but you're not. I guess you could say it that way. You're always, that which you want to escape from always seeks to attach in every moment. And so the blessing is that attachment is still within the aliveness or the freedom itself. Daryl says, I agree, Alex. It can't be anything other than play. Lewis says, or could you say duality is the same as ego interchangeably? I think there's so many different ways to define. I don't try not to use ego too much, because there's so much psychological attachments to that term or connotations to that term, then people kind of get lost in that. So I like to use separate self. Yes, the person character is duality, says Daryl. Yes, the person character is duality. I'm going to challenge you and say that that's not true. Because that is another attachment onto what is, if you will. because the opposite of that, the fact that the person or character is duality, is a story, is unreal. Uh, the truth of the matter is that that person or character is real. Or maybe it's small d duality, or illusory temporal. But like I said, this is all kind of definition of terms, which I think is obviously important when you talk about this topic. But to some extent, you can chop up and redefine and try to come up with the perfect way, the most clear way of saying something, but you'll never get there. You're never really, you can only point to it. And so you can get lost in the terms of definitions of what these words mean, but ultimately the words are kind of irrelevant. Alex says you can't really point to the non-dual. When you say non-dual, it's still dual. Yeah. Yes, Alex, is Daryl. Or you could say that this is Alex. Or you could say that as well that everything is non-dual, therefore there's no point in pointing to it. That's another way of, yes. Daryl says, I never thought I was a sufferer until all these non-dual teachers told me I was. Yeah, that's the funny part of it. I guess that's maybe more, what my channel is geared towards is those that have found non-duality and found it another way to be stuck, I guess. Alex says, yet it seems that objectively there's a difference between knowing it and not. But it means you were ignorant about your holiness, Daryl, now that you have the opportunity to get that certainty. Lewis says, people that believe to be their thoughts are living in ego, right? Is thought duality. I think the question is thought duality. I think what maybe a different way of saying it is language duality, because as human beings, we think in abstract terms such as words, which, I've said this before, but, if there's words that sound like the object it's describing, maybe there's some kind of connection, more direct connection to that. But, when you look at a tree and you say tree, why did we use the word tree in English? Okay, well, it goes back to other past languages, blah, 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 whatever. But in that sense, language, the words that I'm speaking is kind of the first step towards seeing life dualistically, seeing that I exist. I think, therefore I am. I use words, therefore I am. And so in a sense, a thought or language isn't any more of a duality than what we perceived life to be prior to or with language, but it's a easy way to create an illusory world that we believe to be real, because we become attached not even to the essence or the direct experience, the direct connection to the aliveness. We become attached to a representation of what is, which in itself is another object in reality, but we believe our interpretation or description of what we're perceiving is more real or becomes reality to us. That in a sense, it's not how we would describe duality always is prior to human consciousness. But if we don't have human consciousness, we wouldn't perceive it in that way. And so it's kind of like yes and no, which is most of the time the answer to most questions in this realm. Living in non-duality, says Lewis, is to know that you are not thought but a choice. Daryl says, depends on what you mean by real. Lewis says, choice to judge or not judge. Daryl says, isn't it all concepts? I think that comment goes to a discussion of free will versus fate, or choice, if you will. But I think, the trap that you can fall into is that since judgment is seen as a bad thing, then everything in life is, how do I say this? So there's a difference between not having morals and ethics, or being amoral, literally, versus accepting what is. And there's this idea that life should be a certain way, but in this very moment, as your experience is happening, this is what is. And so it can't be any other way. Why am I still here? Did we do it right? Did we mess up? Well, we did the way we should have done it because we're still here. As I butcher the line from the second Matrix when they go to meet the Merovingian. But there's a difference between the non-judging acceptance of what is versus allowing what's the right word? I guess from a Christian perspective, you could maybe say sin or evil, or sitting by, because if you're not judging something and you're not taking an active accepting role into your place into your purpose, if you will, what you're here to do, then you're still playing out a story in a certain way regardless. And so there's nothing wrong with judging in that sense, because and I've kind of talked about this in other videos, but when the idea that, okay, well, everything is what is, I have to accept everything. That means that, well, I got to go through life without being an active participant of it, because life just happens and I can't, if a dog runs out in the road and is standing there going to get hit by the car, and you have the ability to get the dog out of the way, then it's not better to say, well, I guess the dog's going to be hit by the car because that's what's going to happen. And so I think from a stance of judgment, there's a realizing that you are not the ultimate judge of life. That's not your role. That's not your purpose. Daryl says, isn't it all concepts? Exactly. Yes, it is. Alex says, abiding non-dual awareness means not abiding in anything, not even nothingness. Yes, it's just words. Yeah. So I think that's where I think people put non-duality on like this pedestal of, I have to be a certain way, I have to act a certain way, I have to seemingly come across in a put together, still peaceful way. I have to form my words in a certain way so that I'm perceived by others as this non-dual master. And that's not even the point of it. Daryl says, I love the way you take time to reflect, Russ. Well, that's I guess that's what I'm here to do. No, there is a lot of reflecting that happens that Russ Rap does. And Russ Rap does a lot of things that would be perceived by others as not non-dual mastery. And so the beauty of it is I don't care. Even though the past Russ, non-dual guru, maybe would have cared that others would see his life as not put together or not purely peaceful as should be, if Russ wasn't, or if Russ was a being a non-dual guru, or what does Russ add to this conversation if he behaves in a certain way, or thinks in a certain way, or acts a certain way, or has a certain attitude? And that's just another story of what you feel like life should be, or what a messenger should be. That's where something you can reflect on. Alex says, what is all that, sir? What does it mean to accept and surrender or judging? Isn't that you yourself who creates those concepts and give meaning to them? There's no possibility of failing. You can't really sin. The trap is believing there's something wrong, but there isn't. Daryl says, exactly, Alex. Daryl says, there is no sin. There is no suffering. Lewis says, suffering is ego. But to believe that you are thought is to believe that you are separate from source. Daryl says, yes. I guess one thing I would maybe say to that is you can't really sin, and the trap is believing there's something wrong, but there isn't. I guess maybe give that a try. See how that works for you. Try to go through the rest of your day believing that there isn't something wrong, and see how your reactions go for that, and see how you perceive yourself to be in those moments. And I think this is a safe space for non-dual discussions, but you know, if someone were to come to this without an awareness of what we're discussing when it comes to the concept of non-duality, the intellectual discourse of non-duality, and you say there is no suffering, um, and that person is suffering, how would that be perceived by the other? Alex says, no, sir, you're not getting it. Alex, there is really nothing to get. Yeah, it's kind of like my brother-in-law, who watched some of these videos, said, he kind of understood the idea right away, but then it was just a lot of circular reasoning, kind of saying the same thing over and over again. And that's ultimately what ends up happening, because the mind operates in a certain way repetitively or habitually. It serves its function, and it's always there to create meaning, create a story, create the reality that you perceive. And so in that process that seemingly you can't escape from, it's always continual. And so the message of non-duality is always continual. And so it's always something that can be repeated over and over again with no purpose, but the mind is always there to try to interpret, to try to understand what is being discussed. And so it comes across as circular in nature, because there's an attempt at trying to get. And I think you can become lost in the concepts, the discourse of non-duality, and in a sense, that can be a way to intellectualize, or to, what's the right word, see the world in a separate way. And so we can discuss this, there is no suffering, there is no sin. But why are we saying that? Why are we talking about that? Do you get what I mean? Like, what's the purpose of saying that there is no suffering? Like, what do we get out of that? Like, what are we trying to achieve? What are we seeking in defining? It's like when you say everything is relative. That statement in itself is absolute. And so when you say there is no suffering, we're trying to make something solid. We're trying to define life in a certain way in order to get something out of that. And so when you use phrases like there is no suffering to something that always sees suffering, then that's a way to snap yourself out of the identification or the attachment of the reality of the separate self. But that there is no suffering statement, there is no sin, is just another phrase that we attach ourselves onto to try to carve out our own niche of life or define life in a certain way to meet our needs. But the truth of there is no suffering is just as true as there is suffering. And to the person that perceives suffering to be what is, it can be off-putting, to say the least. Lewis says, suffering doesn't mean suffering in every thought and scenario, but the ego has no ability to lead to enlightenment. Daryl says, well, what's the purpose of anything? Well, that's where all of this can lead to nihilism, essentially, of losing all sense of meaning or purpose, which non-duality isn't about really losing anything. It's kind of accepting what is. And maybe witnessing attachments. But then to objectify or to witness your attachments, the way you try to define life, the way you try to create meaning, if that becomes the purpose of non-duality, then it becomes another goal to achieve, a way to say that everything is illusion. Then therefore, if I'm believing something, I need to tear that down, essentially. Becomes a carrot constantly shoved in front of your face that you can never quite reach. And when you fail, then the then the whip comes out. And I think the nature of these discussions can be very intellectual or mental, if you will, partly because that's, part of how I interact with life. But, the intellectual discourse is interesting, but it's just, in a sense, another distraction. All right, here we go. Alex says the ultimate sum up is always equals 0 or 1, which is the same. Lewis says an empty mind or mind of stillness meditation is a mind full of forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't a thought, but ego is. So what is a chaotic mind or a monkey mind or an unstill mind or a busy mind? What is that? Is that not part of the forgiveness? Is that not part of what is? So the ego is a thought. Is that true? Can we be absolutely sure that that's true? To take Byron Katie's advice. So even if, let's say, ego is a thought, that is true, what does that mean? What does that give you by defining it in that way? Lewis says, busy mind believes itself to be the body because it identifies as thought. So whether you're identified or non-attached, or whether your mind is empty or your mind is cluttered, what difference does that make to what is, to reality? If you're lost in thought or separated or having a real bad day, is that any different to the nature of reality than if you're in a completely clear, empty, meditative state? Daryl says, please define ego. Somebody please. Lewis says, are you identified by your thoughts or your actions? When it comes to Freud, you have the id, the impulses, the instincts, the bestial urges, all that stuff underneath the surface that wants to come up and play. And then you have the superego, which is the ones that are setting the rules, the ones that are the part of you that wants to have a sense of ethics or morals or control essentially the impulses. And the ego is kind of in between the superego and the id, dealing the middleman between the control mechanism and the one that wants to uncontrol. But I think a lot of times in psychological or self-help type of frameworks, the ego gets a bad rap and is seen as a negative thing that you want to get rid of or reduce at least. But I've also understood the ego to be something that, to have a big ego is helpful because it's a way to handle what's happening, if you will, or to deal with life, or to engage in life in a powerful way. Alex says, ego is a believing that something called ego exists. Daryl says, thanks, best definition I've heard yet. Ego is the believing that something called ego exists. It's a self-sustaining concept, says Alex. Like a dog chasing its tail. Yeah, I don't know. How do you feel about the thing that believes that it exists? Lewis says, at the end of the day, an ego doesn't serve love because it identifies that you are a clump of thoughts and beliefs, not your actions. So I think what you're trying to say is that there's a difference between your internal reality and what you actually manifest through your behaviors or your actions. And so what you believe or think is not as important as how you interact with life. I think that's what you're saying, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I think depending on how you define ego, I think what ends up, okay, I'm gonna wrap it up here, but I think what ends up happening is, in some of the things I witnessed with non-duality circles, is that it just becomes another kind of religion in and of itself, where depending on the stage of your development or your worldview or your political beliefs, there's a sense that you have to believe or behave in a certain way. And if you don't, then that is your ego. And then you're not living up to the ideals of what you should be living up to. And it's all defined by the groupthink or whatever the leadership of that circle believes. And in a sense, that's just another way to contain non-duality, if you will, to box it in. Because I would say the ego does serve love. Because what is love other than what is? Lewis says, that is what is wrong with religious teachings. Love is the ultimate goal I have today. Right. So it is. So you're saying it is the ultimate goal. So it's something that you aren't. You're not love. It's something that you're trying to achieve. That's what I'm gleaning from what you're saying. And so if you don't act in a loving way, or if you perceive your actions to be less than loving, then you believe yourself to be living in ego, or you could say sin, or however you want to define it. Love is self-knowledge, says Lewis. Okay. What is the self? What does it mean to know thyself? Time nask. Time nask. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here. Lewis says, love is seek knowledge of the self. Is seeking knowledge of the self. Maybe. If I don't agree with you, how does that make you feel? Does that mean I have a big ego? Well, I am the best teacher on non-duality on YouTube, so there you go. But thanks everyone for the chat today. I appreciate it, and until next time, we're gonna wrap it up here. Peace.